Hello, everyone. This is Trip, and this is exciting. Not only is this the first year that we've done a live stream version of Theology Beer Camp, but Dom is going to be the first person to do a digital bonus lecture. So, not only have you been getting to hang out and experience everyone live throughout the event, and then afterwards you'll be able to get in the archive stuff happening on some of the other stages. This is a little treat that is digital only. And I'm just saying, last year at Theology Beer Camp, everyone experienced Dom in the flesh after quite a ride. It was one of the longest plane flights.
From Atlanta to Missouri to Colorado. It's not quite the usual way.
Yeah. But it'll be real hard for a plane to mess this up. As long as all those tubes that carry around the internet still work. So we're very glad to have you do this. Not only will you get to hear Dom lecture, we'll do some questions and such after. And this is also kind of a good way of getting to know about Tom's or the brand new book on Paul the Pharisee. And we'll have links and stuff so you can go get yourself a copy. So the format, Dom will kick things off, do the lecture. We'll have slides and all that kind of good stuff. Then we'll do some Q&A. And then soon enough, you'll be back hanging out with us in the room at camp, all the viewers. And those of you that came to camp, maybe you're watching this afterwards. You're like, oh, this is what the people on the internet were doing. So, yeah. Are you ready, Dom?
I'm all set, Trip, whenever you are.
All right. And if for some reason people don't know who John Dominic Crossan is, then use Google, because you obviously have a computer right now, and you'll discover he's one of the greatest New Testament scholars around, and he's been working on uncovering Paul in his historical context, and then what Paul's vision of the faith has to contribute and challenge us in the present. So, here we go.
All right. So the very first image, in a way, is very instructive for the whole thing. Look at to the left of the screen. You've got Caesar Augustus. He is divine. And when you're divine, Roman males have a great difficulty remembering to put on their clothes when they're divine, apparently. So he is divine. But the two sides of this screen show the tectonic plates of power. Caesar is power by force, the power of violent force. You can see it in the two. Well, they're bronze, really, so they're gone at the moment. The images in St. Petersburg in the Hermitage Museum, and of course the bronze little Nike victory is long gone, and so is the scepter. But the left-hand scepter is the spear. The scepter descends from the spear, and the orb in his right hand has victory over it. So he is claiming that he has conquered the world by power, which is by force, I should say, by force. And that's basically what imperator means. Now shift over to the other side. You have Jesus. Yeah, they're making divine claims about him too. You see the halo, but notice the cruciform shape of the halo. But this is not power by force. This is power by persuasion. All he's got going for him, in a way, is a book, words, writings, and the right hand is raised in blessing. Now, between these two, as I say, tectonic plates of power comes Paul. And look at him. All he's got going for him in his left hand is a scroll. His right hand is open. It's not even raised in blessing as is the hand of Jesus. It's wide open. It's defenseless, you could say. And it's sort of a bonus that he looks like almost a miniature cross. So this is carefully chosen to summarize what we're going to be doing and the depth of the challenge between these two visions of power. So we'll move to the next slide then, Trip. Here's our subject. Good old Caesar is there. Now Paul is directly there with him. And if you count those scrolls, he's got 10 of them. I don't know whether they're leaving out the pastoral Timothy and Titus, or whether they're putting all his doubles, 2 Thessalonians, 2 Corinthians, 2 Timothys into one. So I leave it to yourself, but he's got 10 of them anyway. And our subject is the historical Paul as Pharisee, as Pharisee. And I'm calling it a vision of post-civilization. And the book attempts to see what that is about. So the next slide then will mention the book. There it is, the full cover, as you can see. And it's published in 2024 by Polbridge Press, which is the press of the Western Institute, which you probably know, the home of the Jesus Seminar. And of course, it's available, as all of Human Affairs are, on Amazon. So moving to the next one. I want to take a look at that carefully chosen image on the cover. And a lot of these images are taken from Monreale Cathedral near Palermo in Sicily, with great gratitude to Sarah for taking the images, first of all, and then cleaning them up and squaring them off in Adobe Photoshop. The Latin, begin with the Latin, which explains what we're seeing. It says, it's easy enough to read the Latin, slightly abbreviated. It says, Paul gives letters, plural, to his disciples, Timothy and Silas, to be taken through the whole world. This is what I'm after. Per universum orbem in Latin, the whole world. So the challenge here is that the answer to Christian nationalism, this is an aside, is not Christian universalism, but human universalism. So hold on to that for a moment. Shift over to the other side, the left side of your screen. Paul's relevance is social and political for all humanity, not just religious and theological for Christianity alone. And that is according to 3 philosophers I use quotes from them as epigraphs to my chapters. The Jewish German philosopher Jacob Taubes, French Alain Badiou, and the Italian Giorgio Agamben. And to be honest with you, here's what happened. In 2021, I had a lot of extra time. So I read these 3 philosophers about Paul. I didn't read anything else. I can't really handle them anywhere else except on Paul. And I quoted them because they claim, look, none of them are acting as Christians or defenders. They think Paul is very important precisely for his relevance. Even if you don't care a hoot about God, Bible, Paul, Jesus, Paul is important for the 21st century. I use them as epigraphs. I mean, in a way to honor their inspiration. But I think you can do a much better job if you know Paul well from the biblical, historical point of view. You could make their points even more firmly. So I'm using them to applaud them, but to say, if you look at Paul, not just from philosophy or theology, but from evolution, you can do an even better job on the relevance of Paul for the 21st century. Okay, so we can move to the next one. All right, starting part 1, the invention of civilization. That's a very important word, invention. It's a cultural phenomenon. It's not evolution itself. And I'm quoting from Walter Benjamin, who died, as you may know, trying to escape from the Nazis from France, occupied France into Spain, and maybe then hopefully into Portugal, and maybe the UK or the USA. He died on the border. There is no document of civilization, he says, which is not at the same time a document of barbarism. Hold on to that, please, throughout this entire lecture. Moving to the next slide. This is the spread of our species the human race. We're only one race, by the way. All this other stuff about races is all smokescreen. We are one race, Homo sapiens. We got out of Africa, and as you can see, we spread everywhere. But here's a quotation from the book. And I'm playing, of course, with the better angels, as mentioned by Abraham Lincoln. The bitter angels of our nature declared an integrated threefold onslaught on the world, on the physical environment, now ever accelerating. And accelerating is what I'm after, climate change. All other species, accelerating biodiversity loss now. Ourselves as well, with ever accelerating weapons of mass destruction. Ever accelerating is the thing. So we now endanger ourselves atomically, biologically, chemically, demographically, ecologically, and we're only up to E in our apocalyptic alphabet. We are doing so well at endangering our species. That's a quotation from page 20. Moving to the next slide. I'm moving back now to that word civilization. You're looking, of course, as you recognize, Mesopotamia, modern Iraq, basically, the land between the rivers. That's what it means in Greek, between the Potamoi. Euphrates to the west, Tigris to the east, and you can see where they almost touch one another around Babylon. Moving then to the next slide. Here we have to read. This is the creation or the invention of civilization. And we're talking about 10,000 to 6,000 BCE. And we're talking about the Neolithic or agricultural revolution, which started, not only, of course, but did start first time in Mesopotamia. Therefore, it is called, in terms of time, the dawn of civilization. And in terms of its place, the cradle of civilization. So we admit it. Now, going to the Bible and two sources. Within the priestly source, you can read Genesis 1, we call it the first creation account, ending with males and females created in God's image. And then you can go directly to pick up the story, same source, in Genesis 5, with Seth as apparently the firstborn son of Adam and Eve. And you pick it up from there. But in between now, you have the Yahweh source in Genesis 2, 3, and 4. Forget anything about punishments or disobediences or sins. None of that is in Genesis 2 and 3. It just ain't there. It's simply describing the unfortunate state of humanization. But read very carefully. And we have not done it. We've spent our time in the garden. Get out of the garden and get to Genesis 4, where all of a sudden it seems Adam and Eve have a different firstborn son, Cain. And in Genesis 4, civilization starts from Cain's murderous violence against, of course, his younger brother Abel, climaxes with Lamech's escalatory violence, which we'll see. So the most succinctly accurate summary of the Neolithic or agricultural revolution and its terrors is found, I'm now speaking literally, in Genesis 4, which, by the way, of course, is the first place in the Bible that sin is ever mentioned. So moving then to the next one. All right, reading down through Genesis 4. It is Cain's descendants who invent the violent normalcy of civilization. Cain builds the first city. Then his descendants, Lamech's descendants, Jabal invents tents and livestock. Jubal invents lyres and pipes. And Tubal-Cain, bronze and iron tools. All of a sudden, as if it's done all at one time. And Lamech invents escalatory violence. That saying, I have killed a man for wounding me, a young man for striking me. Two ways of saying the same thing. You hit me, I kill you. That's called escalation. And then, of course, in case we're missing the point, if Cain is avenged sevenfold, truly Lamech, 70 times sevenfold. Welcome then to civilization. And so it starts. Moving then to the next one. Part 2 then, what I call the search for justification. And I'm using justification, or justice if you prefer, not only in an individual sense, but as we'll see in a cosmic sense. Sort of not just is there individual karma, as it were, but is there a cosmic karma? So we begin with a quotation from Deuteronomy, which seems very simple. If you will only obey the Lord your God, all these blessings will come upon you. And the blessings are prosperity, fertility, and victory. If you will not obey the Lord your God, all these curses will come upon you. And they're the opposite to the blessings, though, to be fair, there's far more curses than blessings as you read through that chapter. But it's all on this earth. It all happens here. If you do this, you're punished. If you do this, you're rewarded here on earth. And if it works, it works. But let's see, moving to the next slide. I'm looking at metaphors, and then they could become parables, about pushing towards cosmic justification. That's that question, is there cosmic justice? Or is it all, some people get away with it, some people don't, and it's kind of all individual. Looking at the first two options, before death or after death. And I'll give you some examples on both sides. The classical one before death is the story of Ahikar. He is a high court official under the Assyrian monarchs, Ashurhaddon and Sennacherib, and he is betrayed unjustly by his nephew, but he defends himself and everything comes out okay. So this is basically set in, let me say, the 600s, probably written maybe in the 500s, and the first copy found in the 400s. So it's the classic story of the high official who falls low unjustly, but is redeemed. That's the story of Joseph, as you know it, of course, from Genesis. It's also the story of Daniel in the lion's den and the three young men in the fiery furnace. Threatened, they're faithful, and they're saved. So the Jews in 3 Maccabees. So everything happens before death. If you're endangered but faithful to God, God saves you. Now, after death, which, look at the two ones that are common. Daniel 3-6, the first half of Daniel on the left, Daniel 12 on the right. What if it doesn't really work? What if somehow you lose your nerve or your faith in that process? Then it depends upon what will happen after death. So you have the suffering servant, Isaiah, you have 2 Maccabees, you have Daniel 12:2, and you have the account in Wisdom. Before death, after death. Where is the justice of God? Where is there justice in this world? Now, after death, we're now getting deeper into the subject. There's 2 main options. Individual ascension, in which somebody's after death is taken up to God or the gods and justified or vindicated or redeemed, or universal resurrection. That's where we have to explain. So moving to the next slide. The first after death metaphor of justification and vindication is called ascension, in Greek, apotheosis. And it's a metaphor, or a parable if it's a story, of personal or individual justification. So look what happened to him, or look what happened to me. That's an image of Antoninus Pius and his wife Faustina. They're ascending up to heaven. And it's one you may have seen if you've been in the Vatican museums. You can hardly miss it at the top of the stairs. And on the right down below is the goddess Roma over her weapons or conquered weapons. And on the left is the Campus Martius, where the obelisk was set up for the sundial of Augustus. So it's the victory of Rome and its military might. And this is what ascension looks like, ascending to the gods. So moving to the next one. What I'm going to do is look at two examples, because basically apotheosis or ascension, I think, is the wallpaper of the Mediterranean world. Everyone, Greek, Roman, Jewish, believed it could happen. It could happen. It mightn't happen to me or you. It mightn't happen to who you claim, but it could happen. Nobody could deny that because the stories told it. Romulus, the founder of Rome, you might say. According to Plutarch, I'm just using one of the sources, there's lots of them, disappeared suddenly, caught up to heaven to become a god instead of a king. And then not only does he ascend, but he is seen, he is revealed. Think of the background of Matthew. As Julius Proclus was traveling on the road, he saw Romulus, stately as never before, bright and shining armor. So he's not only descended to the gods, he comes down back to earth, and he tells the Romans that this is their destiny. They will reach the utmost heights of human power. This, from Plutarch, is a typical example of a Roman founder who ascended among the gods. And in the very next slide, you have exactly the same going to happen for Moses, founder of Judaism, let us say. Now, you'd say, well, wait a minute. Deuteronomy says he died and was buried. There's nothing there about him ascending to God. But see, no one knows his burial place to this day. There's the lure to say, well, if nobody knows his burial place, how do we know he's in one? So Josephus and Philo, as you can see, Josephus says Moses was taken back to divinity. That cloud descended upon him and he disappeared. Philo, he departed from hence to heaven to take up his abode there, and leaving this mortal life to become immortal, having been summoned by the Father. So they're not too worried about having been buried. That can always be arranged by God or the gods. So now moving to the next one. That was the first metaphor, and equally open to Greco-Roman tradition or the Jewish tradition. Some important person, some great general or holy person, some founder could be taken up to the gods, our God. Now, here's a second case. We're moving now from individual ascension to general resurrection, but we're just beginning. This image is from the Santa Maria Antiqua in the Roman Forum, and it shows the Maccabean martyrs, and their names are all there. Salomone, she is mentioned as well, and Eleazar to her right, your left. This is a metaphor of cosmic or universal justification. It's not just, well, we happened to go up to God. He could have said that the Maccabean martyrs were all taken up to heaven, all ascended. Eleazar, they had died for their faith. So, how could Deuteronomy explain this? How could you look at the battered, brutalized body of a martyr and say he or she is being punished for his or her sins? No, something else is going on. So now we're shifting, the great shift from individual even to cosmic, and from before to after death. Look at the the story of the 7 sons. It's a mother with 7 sons. One brother says, the king of the universe will raise us up, anastasai. Now the verb anastemi is coming in. To an everlasting renewal of life, died for his laws. The other brother, I got these hands from heaven, we'll get them back. The fourth brother, one cannot but choose to die at the hands of mortals. Cherish the hope God gives of being raised, anastasistai. Again, the same root, by him. But you persecutors, there will be no resurrection, anastasis to life, uprising. All right, moving to the next one. Now, I want to summarize these two things. I tried to put them side by side. They are two metaphors of after death justification. After death, justification, vindication. Ascension, Greek apotheosis, is a metaphor of individual ascendancy, ultimate personal glory. It can happen anytime to any person, so appropriate. It's a cross-cultural reality, Jewish and Greco-Roman traditions by the 1st century. And an example, of course, would be the Roman emperors. Now, corresponding to that, on the other side, resurrection, Greek anastasis. It's a metaphor of universal responsibility, ultimate cosmic justice, to happen only at end time. Only at end time. And it is accepted only as a sectarian reality within Jewish Pharisaic tradition. Not just Jewish, in other words, but Pharisaic by the 1st century. These are the two great options. And if you imagine at the back of your mind, if you're, as it were, there on Easter Sunday morning and people were having visions of Jesus, there's two options they can go to. And if you say they went to resurrection, then you might ask, why did they not go to ascension? And if you think they went to ascension as their explanation of where Jesus was, as it were, where did resurrection come from? And then at the back of your mind, you're beginning to think, did it come from Paul? Was it ever resurrection before Paul? Or was it always, if anything, ascension? All right, moving to the next. All right, the book says Paul the Pharisee. So we better find out who these characters are. Who are Pharisees? First of all, negatively, don't take anything pretty much said about the Pharisees in the New Testament as historically accurate. In a vast simplicity, you could say that the Essenes were the left wing of Jewish leadership in the 1st century. The Sadducees were the right wing Jewish leadership. There in the center were the Pharisees, controlling the center. And I think Josephus is exactly right. They're considered the most accurate interpreters of the law and hold the position of the leading sect. Now, if you come along and you're a Messianic Christic, I didn't say Christian, I said Christic Jew, you're fighting for the center. And that means that the nastiest things you're going to find in the New Testament are not said about the Essenes or even about the Sadducees, even when you get to the death of Jesus, but about the Pharisees. They're portrayed as nitpicking legalists or hypocrites. And that is simply the infighting of those closest to you. Do not give any veracity to Matthew 23 when he describes brood of vipers and hypocrites and all the rest of it. But you might wonder if Jesus said in Matthew 5 not to call people names, how in Matthew 23 he's doing a very good job of it, and ask yourself, who changed their mind, or his mind, Jesus or Matthew? In any case, what I want to insist on, two things about the Pharisees. One is going to be nonviolent resistance, and the other is going to be universal resurrection. But I want to begin then with Josephus on those. So moving to the next slide, I have to do a little work on Josephus because we have to read Josephus every bit as critically as we would read Luke or anyone else in the New Testament. Not to dismiss him, but to understand what's his intention. For example, in that magnificent image, you're reminded of this. No Jewish tradition has preserved Josephus in the past. It was only under Christian traditions he was preserved. And that was done polemically and apologetically, because in the Middle Ages, Latin translations of the Greek Josephus, French translations, were using it as a parallel. See, we Christians have our Old Testament and our New Testament, and they're corroborated by the Jewish scriptures with the Jewish antiquities of Josephus and the Jewish war. So they were preserving them, and that's why you get beautiful illustrations like that. Josephus is taking his writings, Jewish war in the 70s at least, Jewish antiquities in the 90s, and the two kings over there on the left, the one with the scepter, that's Titus, and the one who's handing the world to him is his father Vespasian. So he is working, as you know, Josephus is as their client. So moving to the next one, in other words, I'm going to be very careful how I read Josephus. Here's his big fear, and this requires a defense. He really, I think, is terrified that the Romans, who penalized all of Judaism after the war of 66 to 73, by taking the donations that used to be made voluntarily to the temple at Jerusalem, that was the equivalent to denarii, say the payment for a laborer, 2 days' work for a laborer, and diverting it from Jerusalem's temple to Rome's temple of Jupiter Capitolinus, Jupiter Optimus Maximus. So I think what really, really scares Josephus is what if the Romans decided that it's our theology, it's our religion that caused the war, or the wars. The same had happened in 4 BCE. What if that was it? So he bends over backwards, and we have to unbend him forward by saying, the Romans, God who went the world, the round of the nations, bringing to each in turn the rod of empire, now rested over Italy. There was, in fact, an established law. I can't forgive him for this. As supreme among brutes as among men, yield to the stronger, and the mastery is for those preeminent in arms. Now you might say, oh, come on, Josephus, you know better than that from your Jewish antiquities. Anyway, the Flavians. So God gave world power to the Romans and gave Roman power to the Flavian dynasty, which would be Vespasian and Titus, and then Domitian. Finally, Vespasian. Vespasian is the Messiah. This is kind of breathtaking. Vespasian is the Messiah. See, it was all a mistake. The Jewish tradition said somebody in Israel or somebody from Israel would become the Messiah. They really meant Vespasian, who was in Israel and who left Israel to go to Rome to become world ruler. So now he's defending the Romans. Secondly, next slide, what he's really afraid of, is not even the violent revolts, but non-violent resistors. Some of the nastiest stuff, honestly, in Josephus is not against the people who rebelled violently, but the people who resisted non-violently. In fact, he equates the Sicarii, who are urban terrorists, actually, with, listen to this, another body of villains with purer hands but more impious intentions, who no less than the Sicarii ruined the peace of the city. Deceivers, impostors, under the pretense of divine inspiration, fostering revolutionary changes. They persuaded the multitude to act like madmen and lead them out in the desert under the belief that God would give them their tokens of deliverance. That takes care of John the Baptist, that takes care of Theudas, and that takes care of the Egyptian, all of whom we know not only from Josephus, but from the New Testament. And then finally, another defense against his great fear. The next slide. This is going to be that. I love that image, by the way. It shows Josephus kind of looking back, I think nostalgically, at his study and moving towards the weapons, as I can see it. I don't think he's leaving the weapons and going back to his books. He's leaving his books and going towards his weapons. In any case, the Essenes, the Pharisees, and the Sadducees, as far as Josephus is concerned, dear Romans, they're just safe philosophical schools. These are not dangerous religio-political factions, all struggling with one another to survive the Roman maelstrom. Oh no, these are just philosophical schools. But watch now what happens as he changes from the 70s to the 90s, from defense to accuracy. In the next slide. Nonviolent resistance. In the Jewish war, he admits that there is a Galilean named Judas. And this is going back to the year 6 when Archelaus is fired and the Roman Coponius comes in and has a taxation census. You remember, it is a property, by the way, according to Josephus. Luke says it's of persons. But anyway, when this comes in, there is resistance by this guy, Judas, who's dismissed as a sophist who founded a sect having nothing in common with the others being, of course, the three Essenes, Pharisees, and Sadducees. So Judas is carefully quarantined in the war. Now, read Antiquities. I couldn't put it all there. Judas enlists the aid of Zadok, a Pharisee. And Judas and Zadok started among us an intrusive fourth school of philosophy hitherto unknown. So he admits there is a fourth school of philosophy. And he says it agrees in all other respects, except this resistance, I presume, with the opinions of the Pharisees. I read that to say, not that all Pharisees are involved in this nonviolent resistance between the great violent revolt of 4 BCE and 66, but that at least it might be an offshoot of the Pharisees. So all of this, I'm imagining what would feed into Paul as a Pharisee. So that's why we're doing all of this. Okay, moving to the next one. And moving to the second thing, the Pharisees and universal resurrection. If you read Josephus's explanation of it, it's you might as well be listening to Plato and the Phaedo, actually. The Pharisees believe souls survive death and there are rewards and punishments for lives of virtue or vice, eternal imprisonment for the bad, good souls, easy passage. That's almost like Phaedo says, he almost invents the Roman Catholic tradition of heaven, hell, and purgatory. But this is written for Greeks to read. Much more accurate, I think, in Luke. Paul recorded the Pharisees. I am a Pharisee, a son of Pharisees. That improves him, of course, his curriculum vitae in Luke. I am on trial concerning the hope of the resurrection of the dead. That is anastasis nekron, the resurrection of the dead ones, the plural. Please always remember that when we read resurrection of the dead in English, it's nekron in Greek, that is genitive plural, of all the dead. So moving to the next one. All right, here's the debate. I love that image from Monreale where Paul is talking to his fellow Pharisees because they're not caricature, they're disagreeing with him, but they're the same learned style that Paul. Anyway, here's the connection that I would like to ask. Is there a connection between pharisaic in universal resurrection as cosmic justice and pharisaic faith in nonviolent resistance against cosmic injustice? Maybe if there is at least final cosmic justice, it's up to God. And Paul himself will make a very similar argument in the Epistle to the Romans. Moving that to the next one. I'm moving to part 4. The mystery of execution resurrection. I'm trying to bring together now what we know about the Pharisees in general and what we know about Paul as a messianic Christic Pharisee. I'm claiming, of course, that Paul never, ever ceased to be a Pharisee. He became a messianic Christic Pharisee. Quoting from St. Ambrose, to start rethinking about the resurrection, not just about Jesus coming out of the tomb, which looks rather like an ascension, but resurrection as cosmic justice. St. Ambrose, 370, in him the world arose, in him heaven arose, in him the earth arose, for there will be a new heaven and a new earth. Moving to the next slide then. Here is the question. I think this is the deepest way I can get into the very heart of Paul. I think here I can almost hear his heartbeat. It's the question that seared his soul, inspired his vision, empowered his mission. And it's not a question I ever asked myself, nor do I find too many other people, but I think it's the question Paul asked. So I have to enter his mind because I wouldn't ask it. Paul thinks, since God knew from all eternity that Roman civilization, so proud of its law and order, justice, and peace, would officially and legally execute Jesus, the Messiah Christ. Why did God permit that to happen? Why did God permit that to happen? By sending the Messiah Christ at precisely that time. I think that's Paul at his deepest moment. Next slide. His answer. And his answer is two parts. I want to read this first. This is what Paul calls the mystery of divine wisdom. This is what he's talking about in all those paradoxical reversals in the first 3 chapters, first 4 chapters of 1 Corinthians. It's not just a general, oh, God is wise and we are humans are dumb. It's very specific. Paul says, I did not come proclaiming the mystery of God. And it's not just a general mystery, it's a very specific mystery, what I just called. I did not come proclaiming the mystery of God in lofty words of wisdom, but we speak wisdom, not of the rulers of this age, they are canton, who are doomed to perish. We speak God's wisdom, secret and hidden, which God decreed before the ages for our glory. None of the rulers, again, are canton, genitive plural, of this age understood this. If they had, they would not have crucified the Lord of glory. And another time in Romans, my gospel, the revelation of the mystery that was kept for long ages, but is now disclosed to all the nations. And then the next 2 slides, we'll see how that operates. First, it has 2 parts, and I'm trying to think of them as 2 sides of the same divine coin, so you can't have one without the other. The divine wisdom of Jesus' execution, about which God knew, allowed, permitted, decreed, decided, choose your verb, from all eternity. The execution of Jesus precisely as the Messiah Christ was the divine revelation to humanity of the violent injustice of Roman civilization, but not just as Roman, but as civilization. We are looking, says Paul, at the savage heart of civilization. And the second part of that same mystery, the divine wisdom of Jesus' resurrection, other side of the same coin. The resurrection of Jesus as the executed Messiah Christ. Note the cross that Jesus is carrying. Note the wounds. Note the halo with his cruciform shape. Note the gates of Hades in cruciform position. I think if you said to Paul, if Jesus had been the Messiah and spent his whole life teaching, preaching, healing, and doing good, and then died in his own bed of old age, would he have been resurrected? I think Paul would have said no, he would have been ascended. So we're talking about the resurrection of Jesus as the executed Messiah Christ. For Paul, it's the divine revelation to humanity of the nonviolent justice of renewed creation. It's not new creation as if the old creation was gone. It's a renewed creation. Not just as an end-time product, but as an in-time process. And here's now where we transition from Paul as Pharisee to Paul as a Messianic Christic Pharisee. Moving to the next slide. Think of it this way. Paul's arguing, and that the Latin in that one says he isn't disputing, he's disputing. Supposing they said to him, imagine the Pharisees, these are not Messianic Christic Pharisees, they're saying to Paul something about the resurrection. We're going to talk to you, Paul, about this weird idea you have of the resurrection. What would they say? Moving to the next slide. They would say something like this. You, Paul, proclaim the resurrection of Jesus as the Messiah Christ. Okay, but resurrection is never individual for this or that person, here or there. They might say that's essential. It is always universal for all of humanity together at end time. How then, Paul, can you speak of an individual resurrection for your Jesus as happening in time? And Paul would respond in the next slide. Paul was able to use slides, apparently. The resurrection of the Messiah Christ is an end-time project as an in-time process. Paul has pulled the end time into the end time. Look at the way he argues. This is 1 Corinthians 15, of course. He argues backwards and forwards. Basically, if there is no end time resurrection, there's no Jesus resurrection. No Jesus resurrection, no end time resurrection. They stand or fall together. Paul cannot even imagine a personal resurrection for Jesus alone. It just doesn't make any sense to him. All he can imagine is that the general resurrection, which demonstrates the cosmic justice of God, has already begun with Jesus. Now, wait a minute. That means that everything is already operational. The resurrection is already going on where every individual who ever lived stands before God, as far as Paul is concerned, to be judged for what they have done. Then heaven and hell are already open for business, Paul. They're already operational. Hold on to that as we move to the next slide. Try now and imagine that, what we've just heard, from the point of view of evolution, not from God for the moment. Because I'm going to be arguing that whether you are a theist or an atheist, you should use your verb. Admit that your God operates by evolution, or evolution operates without God. If you don't accept that, use a simple test and see whether gravity works differently for a theist or an atheist. I don't suggest you do it. I suggest you just think about it. Okay, I'm going to go back to Walter Benjamin for my last part. He says, nothing that has ever happened should be regarded as lost for history. Nothing. Only a redeemed mankind receives the fullness of its past. Only for a redeemed mankind has this past become citable in all its moments. Okay, it's only like at the general resurrection. Could you imagine the whole of everything that's ever happened to everyone? Even imagine it. But if that has already started, then we should be able to imagine it. And maybe we better start thinking about big history, which is another word for evolution. All right, moving to the next ones. And we just have a short while. I want you to think about the evolutionary challenge of Paul's Pharisaic vision on evolution, on universal resurrection. It's an end time process. Divine sanctions, universal resurrection, general judgment, eternal sanctions, divine forgiveness possible, divine mercy available. That's Paul then. I want to look at Paul now. Instead of divine sanctions, I want to talk about human consequences. Universal resurrection as universal responsibility. General judgment as general accountability. Eternal sanctions as ultimate results. Divine forgiveness means that human change is possible. Evolutionary forgiveness means that human change is possible. We are not locked in to what we are. We can change. And evolutionary mercy is that change time is available until it's too late. We can change, and we have a time within which we can change. That is how I read Paul as relevant in terms of evolution for today. Moving to the next one. The evolutionary challenge of Paul's Pharisaic vision on nonviolent resistance. You notice how Jesus argues. Jesus argues that by human nonviolent resistance participates in the nonviolent resistance of God, because God doesn't take it out on the evil and the good. He sends rain on, he sends the sun to both of them, and he doesn't pick on the unrighteous. He gives them the same rain. All right. That's how Jesus justifies nonviolent resistance. Paul is different. Paul in Romans says, coming as close as possible. He doesn't say love your enemies, but he comes almost as close to say it. Persecute, bless those who persecute, bless, do not curse, don't avenge, but leave room for God, who is the avenger. I wonder if that on the right is exactly how Paul the Pharisee did and continues to do his justification of human nonviolent resistance. That is up to God, which would be fine. If we settled for that, it would vastly improve the world. But it's slightly different from Jesus. Okay, moving to the next one. This is a quotation from the book. And in one sense, this is the challenge of the book. If you read this book as a committed theist or an atheist or somebody who doesn't care a hoot about either of them, you or we live together within evolution. I don't know how to get around that. I don't know how not to see it. And Paul's Pharisaic vision of universal responsibility, cosmic accountability, in the now time, he insists that it's now, not in the future, now, of his messianic Christic vision, can best be described, for me at least, as an intuition of evolution, presented as a revelation of God. And, there's a question left hanging behind that, whether religion is actually always in its validity an intuition of evolution. Moving then to the last one, it's the second last one actually. Successive and accumulative matrices for Pauline interpretation. You look at Paul just within the Christian matrix, especially in the Reformation, where he is considered as a, let us say, a Jew who left Judaism to become a Christian, just like Luther was wise enough to leave Catholicism to become a Protestant, and he can be used polemically in that Christian matrix. Or he must be put inside the Jewish matrix of what he was, a messianic Christic Pharisee, which insists this is not just the new Paul as Jew, this is the new Paul as Pharisee. He's a special type of Pharisee. It's a little bit condescending to say Paul was a Jew, as if every Jew in the first century was the same, as if anyone, any whole group ever is the same. But Judaism was under Romanization in the first century. We're looking at the Jewish homeland under initial Romanization. You can't take Paul or Jesus out of the Roman matrix. And finally, I'm trying to ask us to begin to imagine the future. And I'm showing these as Matryoshka Russian nesting dolls because each one is taken into the other. You don't leave one and move to the other. So the Christian is taken into the Jewish, inside the Roman. But I think we have a fourth evolutionary matrix. We have to start thinking about it. And all I'm doing in this book, quite frankly, is groping my way towards it, hoping that maybe we can start thinking about it, that this is at least the fourth matrix. I'm not going to say the ultimate matrix. I'm not going to take any wages on the future, but at least the fourth matrix. And then my concluding and last slide is just sort of to remind us of something. Here's the question. Maybe you should have had in your mind when we all started. Who's afraid of the big bad Paul? Who's afraid of the big bad Paul? The answer, most of the New Testament. And I think if you take a good look at Paul the Pharisee, you begin to understand why his challenge and his relevance scares the living daylights out of most of the New Testament and much of Christian tradition. And that is our last slide. Trip, thank you very much for.
All right. That was great. I feel like you. There we go. There's the digital clapping.
Oh, that's digital clapping.
Oh.
Goes on for hours.
Yeah, when it's just a button, we could see how well it goes. The look, I really enjoyed this book, and I think you brought out a number of the different places that taking, like, kind of integrating a lot of the scholarship around Paul, from discovering him more in the Jewish context, the Pharisaic context, and all that kind of stuff, and then placing it in kind of the shared challenge of us as a species. And one of the things that's fascinating about it is the philosophers that you're talking about. I think you're right. Like, I had this very similar experience in a PhD seminar on philosophers that are reading Paul.
Oh, you did good.
And thinking, it would be good if they just had a little bit more accurate understanding of Paul. I think they could do better. But one of the questions they're asking that you can see Paul asking in his own context is, what has to happen for the individual to have a subjectivity or an identity where the narrative that frames them and the values that orient them aren't the domination system of the time, civilization, in your book. For someone like Badu, he's thinking like, how do you have a subject at the end of modernity, when you realize modernity or civilizations created this extractive relationship to the planet, an oppressive one economically to so many across the poor. It's generated a culture where we desire to go faster, to accumulate, and all these, and we can see the results as this kind of a death dealing system, but we can't imagine another world. But it's in that context that these philosophers go to Paul and go, he thought there was an ability for a subject to orient itself towards a world that it was born into, but no longer under its law, right? And that, like, that connection point just utterly fascinating to me, and it's one that I think those philosophers are reading the times correctly. That there's an increasing number of people who think they were born into this world where there's an interpretation of the world through civilization. There's a structure of power and meaning and our institutional web, and it tells us who we are and gives us a little bitty imagination space for how we get to live our lives. And we're trying to decide how to find a place in it because the consequences of it are death. Increasingly, you get burnt out as an individual. We're burning up our planet. And then now we're wanting to burn down our institutions, and that ongoing acceleration state of civilization. We go, well, what does it even mean to be human? And is there a version of being human, say a new way to be human beyond this? And I thought I've had all those intuitions. The book and in your presentation names them in such a powerful way. Anyway, that was just me telling you how much I love the book. I'm sure there's a question when I started, but it disappeared, Dom.
Yeah, no. There is a question, very, very much, Trip. I mean, in one sense, the word post. Originally, when I turned in the book, by the way, the subtitle was Paul the Pharisee: A Vision of Post-Civilization. And my editors and publishers thought, well, maybe that people won't know what you're talking about. And in one sense, yes, post-civilization, it sort of blows your mind. How can you even imagine? Isn't civilization? So the only other thing I see in the book that I said that we don't have an original sin, but we do. Our problem is not an original sin. Our problem is an original state that we have individual wills and we're a social species. I think that we have to face is an anomaly. If I wanted to be cynical or negative, I could say we're an evolutionary joke, a bad joke. We're a contradiction in terms, or we're an evolutionary challenge. I think we're an anomaly. I think any bee, any termite would tell us this is no way to run a nest or a hive. So we're asked to walk a tightrope. Now, when I look at somebody like Paul, if he was all about himself, I wouldn't be that impressed. But the first thing he does is try to get a community. The letters are not manifestos. Even the closest it comes to a manifesto, Romans, is written to a community. I don't see any other way, honestly, except that human awareness could get to the point that we have to get back, that we have maybe put it either too far towards individualism. And honestly, when I think of somebody like Hitler or Stalin, I don't know whether that's too much of the community controlling or too much of the person. We have to figure out, this is our anomaly, this is our challenge. If we survive, we will not have gone totally to artificial intelligence, for example, and abandon that, or totally to what we need is one person in charge of the whole world, and this one person will save us. I mean, those are the two extremes. You ricochet from one to the other, and we're ricocheting for them right now in our election cycle. So it's terribly, terribly close. There is a vision. I'm talking within Christianity. I challenge every other religion to do the same. I have no concept that only Christianity has the answer. But I want Christianity to unleash its own answer.
Yeah.
Because it has simply gone over to the other side.
Yeah, because when you think of like Paul, right? Like, part of the interest isn't he's just thinking of an individual, but of communities. And even in his letters, the community, all the words he's using are actually connecting to the resurrected body, right? Like you're baptized into the body of Christ. You are and then there are the use of things like ecclesia, which have these political dimensions to it, like an alternative allegiance and citizenship. Um, and it seems to me that there's this the community functions both of a reorientation of one's identity, like towards the other, like neighbor and enemy, these kinds of things, and we see very practical concerns in the letters of Paul about what is it like to be neighborly with each other, what is it like to
Yeah.
care for, say, even the Judaizers that think I'm a heretic, and this kind of stuff, and an invitation where your identity is already one that's transcended the binaries of civilization. Right? So when you get in Christ, right,
Mhm.
this community body, there's neither this nor that. Right?
Yeah.
And the categories are the ones the kind of like dividing binaries that structure uh, Roman law as natural
Yeah.
in the world. So that I think that communitarian element in Paul is just it's ubiquitous, and oddly enough, that language gets diminished in a lot of contemporary church life.
It- it- of the three authors, I felt closest to Giorgio. Maybe I'm Italian without deep, um, because he's talking about kairos, and kairos doesn't have a chronos. You can write a history of the church, of course you can, um, but kairos is episodic. It's not linear. It's not cyclical. So I think wherever we find people speaking for, pleading for, living for resistance to this, we have a kairotic moment. And I think that's very important. That it's not just even what I said earlier, the answer to Christian nationalism and not Christian universalism, but what does it have to say about human universalism? So that's what I'd ask of every religion today. Of course, you have your own language and your own traditions that you speak inside your sanctuary, as it were. And I can speak that language too, the language in which Christ, not Caesar, is God, for example. But what do you have to say in the public square? How does your particular religion translate into the normal language of the public square? And I'm not talking about partisan politics. I'm talking about what does it have to say about post-civilization? Otherwise, you are interesting, you're quaint, you might be quite lovely, but you're irrelevant.
How does one of the contrasts between Paul and Jesus is Paul was a citizen of of Rome, of the kind of archetype of civilization at that point. Like, how does the role of Paul's citizenship in his narrative perhaps help us reflect of people who are citizens in the West and the parts of the globe that function similarly today?
All right, you may have noticed, I'm sure some people have noticed that what I don't know if I ever even mentioned in that whole uh, video or interview anything about Luke. I don't think I ever mentioned Luke because obviously in a fuller
Yeah.
discussion, and the whole book has to get Paul out of Luke so we can see him clearly.
Hmm.
Not because Luke is mistaken. Luke is a genius. He knows exactly what he's doing. He's getting ready for Constantine. He doesn't know that yet, but that's what he's doing. So Paul never tells me he's a citizen. He tells me he was beaten with rods. He distinguishes that, which is a Roman penalty. It's Luke who says he's a citizen. And he does it the first time when Paul is put in prison and says nothing about being a citizen. He's beaten, he's in prison. When he gets out, Paul says, "You have to apologize to me because I'm a citizen." Okay, Luke, I get what you're doing. If you said he was a citizen up front, we wouldn't have your story. So when Paul finally says he's a citizen in Jerusalem at the very end, I don't think so. Luke consistently, from Jesus in chapter 4 of Luke to Paul, upgrades their curriculum vitae, the resume. Jesus can read unpointed Hebrew scroll and find his way to what's, I don't know, chapter 64, 1 we would call it, or whatever it is. I don't think Jesus was literate. I think Paul was a literate scholar. I think Luke upgrades him. He's not only a Pharisee, but a son of Pharisees. Okay, his parents were, as it were, Pharisees, at least his father. He was educated under Gamaliel in Jerusalem. But Paul says, nobody in Jerusalem knew me when I went there the first time, Christians at least. So I spend a lot of time carefully and with integrity separating what Luke says about Paul and what Paul says about Paul, and figuring out when I can use Paul, when I can use Luke, and when I should not. So I don't find that Paul was a Pharisee. I think that Paul was a
citizen.
I meant to say. What I do notice, and Paul must have known, that Paul can travel around the whole Roman Empire relatively freely. He can go into a city and nobody says, here's a stranger, let's kill him just in case. The sea lanes are relatively free of pirates. The roads are relatively free of bandits. He's only able to do what he does because of Rome. So, yes, he is very much aware he is fighting Rome as simply the incarnation of civilization in a toga, as it were, because of Rome. And that's exactly where we find ourselves in the democratic countries of the West. You can't do it in Russia. You have to be very careful what you say. Russian Orthodoxy has gone over to Putin, so they already have religious nationalism gloriously triumphant in Russia. We saw it when you walk into the northeast corner of the Red Square. The first things you hear in the morning is chant from the churches, the monasteries there. They're working very well together. So what we're dealing with really is we have the liberty to do something. We are primarily responsible. At least as of now, pending the next election. And therefore the book is there either to support one possibility or to help us suffer through another possibility. But the responsibility of those who have freedom of speech and freedom of activism is tremendous. It's up to us.
Mm-hmm. So, yeah, and I think there's another element of it too that Paul's vision helps is when you recognize that the challenge of the resurrection is in a sense an eschatological horizon for every moment, then none of the particular historical contingencies of the present is the final solution, right? I think that's one of the temptations that happens when people orient their theological vision to the present. Then they think this is the end all and be all. But regardless of what happens, and this is something Caputo, who I know endorsed the book and you've engaged with it, has pointed out about this element in Paul is whatever happens, even the most approximation towards justice that could happen in any moment, the next moment is met by the coming of the resurrection or the judgment of God or whatever language we want to use, but that whatever exists in the present is always already about to be deconstructed again, because the call towards justice finds its purchase in what's happened.
I was trying to say the same thing by looking at that opening image caught in the tectonic plates. I mean, that the two types of power are there permanently. One time, I also got that very much from Giorgio Agamben, the now time. You can't have Kairos can't have a Chronos. So I have a date with my oculist to take a field of vision test. I have to do it. And you know, when you're doing that, your face is fixed and there's sparks going off here. You're supposed to hit your little button and the computer reads it all up. I go through this regularly. I think those are like the Kairos moments. You know, they're not a nice line because then I'd be great. They're not a circular. I'd catch that. They can be coming anywhere, and they are not, of course, restricted to Christianity. Absolutely not. At their best, we're seeing them there. So Kairos does not have a chronos. You're quite right. But it is, if I could use it this way, if heaven and hell are open for business and operational, as I think they are, judging by the evening news, it would be great if you could break even. It would be great if you weren't kind of a little bit convinced that the balance is going a little bit more towards hell than towards heaven on earth. Because I'd settle for Kairos. And I don't expect, you're quite right, that we get this, then everything will be. That's a delusion.
Yeah. One of the questions that, and you discuss this in the book, and you hinted at it some here, is how Paul sees the law. I think a lot of people who read Paul, right, with those intuitions of Luke Acts, of some of the post-Pauline text in his name, and especially through its reception in church history, will not recognize how the law functions for him, and then you end up with things like the way Romans 13 gets used to legitimate this or that, or how the two kingdoms vision in Protestant history legitimated church subservience to totalitarian regimes.
Let me think about that. I think the primary grasp that anyone would have when in the Roman Empire you talk about law, it's going to be Roman law they think about, not Jewish law. I think when Paul speaks about the law, I think the primary thing he has in mind is not the Jewish law, but the Roman law. This is their boast. I mean, it's the boast of empires always, that we bring you people law and order, justice and civilization. That's what the British Empire brought to the wild Irish, of course. We bring you law. So now when law kills the Messiah, I think this is what directs Paul against the Roman Empire, but deep enough, as I said, there's not just, if it wasn't Roman, if it was something else, some other type of empire would be fine. Maybe a Christian empire. Empire is simply the clothing of civilization itself. Now a toga, now something else, now a suit or whatever else. So I think Paul, that's what he means by law. Law executed the Messiah. He wasn't lynched by a mob. He wasn't run over by a chariot accidentally. He was formally, legally, as far as Paul is concerned, put to death by Roman law. Now, that does push Paul to say, my way of summarizing Paul is, Paul might say, the function of law is the obstruction of justice. I think that's the best way in a one-liner I can summarize the function of law. If you push them, say, that's not fair, it's not the function, well, at least the result of law. And honestly, I'm trying to imagine the heading, above the architrave of the Supreme Court, equal justice under law. I think that's what it is, equal justice under law. Now, I ask you, if you stand today before the Supreme Court, and you look up and you see equal justice under law, do you think that's a redundancy? Two ways of saying the same thing? Or a oxymoron? That you have equal justice or you're under law. Take your choice, because law will not get you to justice. And maybe those who control things have made it quite definite that it won't. That's what I see the deep question of law in Paul. And it's more profound than Jewish law, even of Roman law. But it's very pointed towards Roman law.
Mm-hmm. So one last question, and there's so much more people will experience when they check out the book. But a lot of conversations around within the church around the resurrection are arguing about interpretations of it, right? Where you get the distinction you draw between individual ascension and universal resurrection are really helpful. But it seems that part of what you're inviting us to reflect on is that for Paul, there's not just this universal element of the resurrection, but it's also, in a sense, a doctrine that requires practice. Paul wants us to practice it in our own context, in relationship to the structures of civilization where we find ourselves.
Yeah, I think starting with Jesus. Jesus talks about using the old-fashioned directing, the kingdom of God. Now, I know people don't like that because it's masculine outside, but it's God's rule on earth. But kingdom of God, you can't have a kingdom of one. I mean, I know Jesus didn't do this. If he wants to stalk around Galilee saying, I am the king, fine. But he cannot stalk around Galilee saying, I am the kingdom. You need at least two people for even a small kingdom. So the language is communal from the beginning. Now, the resurrection, again, you're saying the same thing about Paul. Again, ascension can be of one, resurrection cannot be of one. It cannot be of one. So you're forced again and again to think corporately and, in fact, universally, not just corporately but universally. So I think you have to, because that's the way they think of it. They think of it that way.
Mm-hmm. Well, I really appreciate this, Dom. I hope everyone on the stream or watching later realizes they got quite the invitation. The invitation that the end time project of God is an end time invitation to a process, and that's a
Say something, Trip. I just
yeah.
thought of it. I got distracted. I think Jesus might say, and if you people don't enter the kingdom, there ain't no kingdom. It's not like it's not. You could see a church, and if nobody goes in, it's still there. It doesn't disappear. But the kingdom of God ain't here if we ain't in it. It's not like it's somewhere here and we just go into it. But if we leave it, Paul is saying the same thing. I think if I said to Paul, well, now, Paul, if nobody accepted that the resurrection was operational, would there be a resurrection? I think Paul would say, oh, no. There'd just be an ascension. Jesus has been taken up to God and nobody particularly cares. Or maybe thinks that someday they will. But that's not resurrection. That's multiple ascension or something. And also one other thing, because it was important for me looking at Eastern or Western Easter, that I could see our Western Easter. We talk resurrection, but we depict and describe ascension. Jesus coming out alone. Whereas Eastern Easter, Jesus coming out, taking Adam and Eve out by the hand. That's the whole human race. So I see these things as coming together. There's a sort of a negation of resurrection. Okay.
Oh no, that I think that's really helpful. I've in describing, and I've often said that you can have an empty church, right? Like so, but Paul's invitation is moving from like church as building to church as a body,
Oh yeah.
and body requires that, and or a lot of the image of the church from from really its embrace of civilization in the empire was the church as the ark of salvation. And I think what you're opening up here is this invitation not to the church's ark of salvation, but the ark of history. That the people of God are called to participate in this in this much larger story, rather than escape into an elected institution.
Yes. Thank you, Chip, very, very much, by the way, for all of this.
Oh, well, thank you. It's always a treat to get to talk to you, and I'm looking forward to getting to do it again soon. And hopefully next year at Theology Beer Camp, we'll have you in person with a flight that works, so you aren't completely tired and can have more than half a drink before you fall asleep. Because when there's nothing quite like being jet lagged with no sleep to impact all